We cannot even feed our children.
Have been arrested and several killed since the protest began on Thursday.
In the heart of West Africa lies Nigeria, a nation of remarkable contrasts, vibrant cities teeming with life, yet burdened by profound challenges. This is a country where resilience is woven into the fabric of everyday life, but where hope is increasingly being tested. Over the past year, Nigeria has been gripped by an economic crisis, unlike any seen in a generation. The price of everyday essentials has skyrocketed, unemployment has soared, and millions of Nigerians are struggling to make ends meet. For many, the promise of a better tomorrow feels further away than ever. But in the face of these hardships, a powerful force has emerged.
Tired of being hungry. We cannot even feed our children. One tuber of yam is 5,000.
The voice of the people. Across the nation, from the bustling streets of Lagos to the quiet towns of the north, Nigerians have taken to the streets, demanding change, justice, and accountability. They march not just for themselves, but for the future of a nation they refuse to give up on. Yet, their cries for justice have been met with a harsh and unforgiving response. What began as peaceful protests against economic suffering has escalated into a standoff with a government that sees dissent as a threat. A government that, in the name of stability, has chosen to silence its critics through intimidation, violence, and the heavy hand of the law. In the capital city of Abuja, 10 individuals stand accused of a crime that carries the gravest of consequences: treason. Their alleged offense, daring to speak out against the very conditions that have driven millions to the brink of despair. Among them, a British citizen accused of conspiring to destabilize the government, faces accusations that could lead to his execution. This is not just the story of a trial. It is the story of a nation at a crossroads, where the fight for survival has become a fight for the soul of Nigeria. A story of courage and defiance, of repression and fear, and of a people who will not be silenced. As the world watches, we delve into the heart of Nigeria's struggle, to uncover the truth behind the headlines and to give voice to those who risk everything in the name of freedom. This is their story. In a country where every naira counts, the rising cost of living is more than just a statistic. It's a daily struggle, a fight for survival. For many Nigerians, the economic crisis of the past year has been a slow burn, a simmering pot of frustration, anger, and despair. But like all fires, this one was destined to explode. The tipping point came when the price of fuel, the lifeblood of Nigeria's economy, skyrocketed overnight. Transportation costs soared, and the price of food became unbearable. People who had once managed to scrape by now found themselves slipping into poverty. And in their desperation, they found a common enemy, a system that seemed designed to keep them down. Across the country, the call to action spread like wildfire, ignited by the power of social media and the voices of those who had had enough. It started with small gatherings, students, workers, and ordinary citizens, standing in solidarity, refusing to remain silent any longer. But what began as a murmur soon swelled into a roar. From the coastal city of Lagos to the dusty streets of Kano, the people of Nigeria rose up. They carried banners demanding justice, chanted slogans for change, and sang songs of resistance that echoed through the streets. Their message was clear. They were tired of suffering, and they would not be ignored. Among the protesters were young people, many of whom had never known a life outside of economic hardship. They were the children of the crisis, born into a world where opportunities were scarce and survival was a daily battle. But with this protest, they saw a chance to fight back, to take control of their future, and to demand the change they had been promised for so long. But this movement was not just about economics. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the right to be heard. For too long, these voices had been dismissed, ignored by those in power. But now, united by their shared struggle, They had found their strength in numbers. This was more than a protest. It was a cry for justice, a plea for accountability, and a demand for a government that serves its people rather than oppresses them. It was a moment of solidarity, where strangers became allies, united in a common cause. But as their numbers grew, so did the dangers they faced. The government watched with unease, seeing not a peaceful protest, but a threat to its authority. And as the crowds swelled in the streets, the tension between the people and the state began to reach a boiling point. In the eyes of the government, these protests were more than just an expression of discontent. They were a direct challenge to its power. And in a country where dissent is often met with force, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change the lives of many and shape the future of Nigeria. The protests were a storm brewing on the horizon, and for the government of Nigeria, that storm was quickly approaching. As the streets filled with voices demanding change, those in power saw not a democratic expression, but a direct challenge to their authority. And in a country where power is often maintained through control, the government's response was swift and severe. At the heart of this response was a deep-rooted fear. Fear of losing control, fear of a populace emboldened by their own suffering, and fear of what these protests could inspire. In the eyes of President Bola Tinubu and his administration, the protests were not just about economic hardship, they were about power and the potential for that power to slip from their grasp. But behind the official rhetoric of maintaining order lay a more cynical calculation: to discredit and dismantle the movement before it could gain more momentum. The protesters were labeled as agitators, troublemakers, and most ominously, enemies of the state. The government claimed that these were not just ordinary citizens expressing their grievances, but dangerous elements seeking to destabilize the nation. In the days that followed, the government's words were matched by its actions. Security forces were deployed across the country with a clear mandate: to quell the unrest by any means necessary. What began as a show of force quickly escalated into something far more brutal. The crackdown was swift and merciless. In cities across Nigeria, peaceful demonstrations were met with batons, bullets, and brutality. Security forces moved in with overwhelming force, dispersing crowds with tear gas, water cannons, and in some cases, live ammunition. The streets that had once echoed with chants for justice were now filled with screams of fear and cries of pain. For many protesters, the consequences were immediate and severe. Hundreds were arrested, swept up in the chaos and thrown into overcrowded jails, their fate unknown. Others were not so fortunate. Shot down in the very streets where they had dared to raise their voices. The exact number of those killed remains disputed, but what is clear is that the government was willing to spill blood to silence dissent. For those who survived, the scars, both physical and emotional, would be long-lasting. But the government was not content with merely crushing the protests on the streets. They sought to make an example of those who had dared to stand against them. Arrests continued in the days and weeks that followed, targeting not just the protesters themselves, but anyone suspected of organizing or supporting the movement. Lawyers, activists, journalists, no one was safe from the government's reach. And at the center of this dragnet were 10 individuals who now faced the most serious charge of all: treason. The charge of treason, a crime punishable by death, was a clear signal from the government. Dissent would not be tolerated. These 10 individuals, ordinary citizens driven to action by extraordinary circumstances, now stood accused of attempting to destabilize the very fabric of Nigeria. Among them, a British citizen, Andrew Wynne, was accused of being a foreign mercenary, sent to sow chaos and topple the government. But for all the government's accusations, one thing was conspicuously absent: evidence. The charges, many believed, were nothing more than a desperate attempt to stifle opposition, to send a message to the nation: defy us, and you will pay the ultimate price. As the world watched, the trial became a focal point for the growing discontent within Nigeria and beyond. human rights organizations condemned the government's actions, calling the charges a blatant abuse of power, an attempt to crush any semblance of resistance. But for the accused, this was more than just a trial. It was a fight for their lives and for the future of a nation at a dangerous crossroads. As the dust from the streets settled, the battle for Nigeria's future moved from the chaos of the protests to the quiet tension of the courtroom. Here, in the heart of Abuja, 10 individuals faced the fight of their lives, charged with treason, a crime that could cost them their very existence. The Nigerian government, in its bid to quash the uprising, had chosen to make an example of these men and women. They were not just protesters. They were, in the eyes of the state, enemies of the nation. The charge of treason, one of the most severe in the penal code, hung over their heads like a sword, threatening to drop at any moment. But in this courtroom, it was not just the accused who were on trial. It was Nigeria's justice system itself, a system that had long been criticized for its harshness, its susceptibility to political influence, and its role as a tool of repression. The prosecution, representing the full weight of the Nigerian state, painted a damning picture. They accused the defendants of conspiring to overthrow the government, of seeking to destabilize the nation during a time of crisis. They argued that these protests were not merely an expression of public dissatisfaction, but a coordinated attempt to incite rebellion, to bring down the government by force if necessary. Central to their case was the presence of Andrew Wynne, the British citizen accused of being a foreign mercenary. The prosecution claimed that Wynne had orchestrated the protests, funded them, and even trained protesters to act as insurgents. Yet, as damning as these accusations were, they were conspicuously thin on evidence. Throughout the trial, the prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of government officials and security personnel. But there was little in the way of concrete proof. No documents, no recordings, no clear link between the accused and the alleged plot to destabilize Nigeria. The evidence was circumstantial at best, and at worst, fabricated. The defense, in stark contrast, argued that this trial was nothing more than a politically motivated show of force. They claimed that the charges were trumped up, designed to intimidate and silence dissent, rather than to serve justice. The accused, they argued, were not criminals, but citizens exercising their constitutional right to protest. With each cross-examination, the defense sought to unravel the government's narrative. They questioned the credibility of witnesses, highlighted the lack of tangible evidence, and exposed the inconsistencies in the prosecution's arguments. Time and again, they returned to the same point. This was a trial about fear, not facts. A trial where the defendant's real crime was daring to speak out against a government that had failed its people. For the accused, the trial was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for their lives. Many had already spent weeks in overcrowded, unsanitary prison cells, their health deteriorating with each passing day. The prospect of the death penalty loomed large, a constant shadow over every moment of the trial. But it was also a fight for their dignity, for the right to stand up against oppression, and for the principle that no government should be able to silence its people through fear. Their defense was not just a legal strategy. It was an assertion of their humanity, a refusal to be reduced to mere pawns in a political game. Yet, despite the defense's efforts, the outcome of the trial remained uncertain. Nigeria's judicial system, long criticized for its lack of independence, was under immense pressure. The government, eager to reassert its authority, watched closely, knowing that the verdict would set a powerful precedent. As the trial dragged on, it became a flashpoint for broader debates about justice, human rights, and the limits of state power in Nigeria. Human rights organizations, both domestic and international, condemned the trial as a travesty of justice, calling for the immediate release of the accused. They argued that the case was emblematic of a government willing to use the judiciary as a weapon against its own people. But the stakes were not just legal, they were deeply personal. For the accused and their families, the trial was a daily ordeal, a test of their resolve and faith. For the Nigerian people, it was a reminder of the dangers that came with speaking out, of the high cost of dissent in a country where the law could be bent to serve those in power. And as the final arguments were made, the nation held its breath, waiting to see whether justice would prevail, or whether the hammer of repression would fall once more. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and impassioned arguments, the trial had reached its climax. The eyes of the nation, and indeed the world, were fixed on a single room in Abuja, where the fate of 10 accused protesters hung in the balance. This was not just a verdict on their actions, but a judgment on the very soul of Nigeria's justice system. For days, the courtroom had been a battleground, a place where the rule of law clashed with the iron fist of political power. But now, the noise had subsided. The arguments had been made, the evidence, or lack thereof, presented, and the final word spoken. All that remained was the decision of a single judge, a decision that would reverberate far beyond the walls of this courthouse. In a nation where the scales of justice often tip towards those in power, the outcome of this trial was far from certain. The judge's decision would be seen as a litmus test for Nigeria's judiciary, a system criticized for its susceptibility to political influence and its harsh treatment of dissenters. Would the court uphold the principles of justice, or would it bow to the pressures of a government determined to maintain its grip on power?